Well, good afternoon, everyone. Please continue with your dessert and coffee. I know most of you. I'm Bob Jordan, diplomat in residence and adjunct professor here in the Tower Center. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. Particularly want to welcome my Tower Center board colleague, Talmadge Boston. Good to have you. And a couple of our Tower Center scholars are here in the current and incoming class. We're delighted to have you all with us as well. It's a great pleasure to introduce my friend Chase Untermeyer. You have his biography in front of you, and I won't repeat all of it, but I do think there's some points that are very interesting. He's a graduate, 1968 graduate of Harvard College, which my classmates and I always used to call the Duke of the North. He served in the Navy on a destroyer, of course, in the Vietnam War. He has been a reporter. He's been in the Texas House of Representatives. He served in Washington, D.C. under President Reagan, and then President Bush 41 selected him to be the Director of Presidential Personnel. I can relate to that job pretty well because my friend Clay Johnson held that position under Bush 43 and was partly responsible for luring me into the ambassadorial ranks in 2001. But a lot of what I think Ambassador Untermeyer is going to talk about today comes from this experience in Washington and in presidential personnel. Then, of course, he was also the director of the Voice of America. What a terrific career. He is based in Houston, served as ambassador to Qatar from about 2004 to 2007, something like that. And so we didn't really overlap as ambassadors, but we've continued to be in touch over the years. It's just a great pleasure for me to welcome Ambassador Chase Untermeyer.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Bob. This is a day I've been looking forward to since I jumped on an offer that Ambassador Jordan made when he made a visit to Houston to come up here and speak. My rule, going back to the days I was a local politician, is to speak to groups of one or more. And, this definitely qualifies. And I'm grateful in particular to be at the John Tower Center. I say that because it was my great pleasure and honor to know the late Senator John Tower. And in fact, the dawn of my involvement in politics was in the spring of 1961, when there was a special election for the U.S. Senate seat that had been held by Lyndon Johnson, who resigned it to become John F. Kennedy's vice president. And I was a junior high school student involved and interested in politics. Now, someone once said that politics is Hollywood for ugly people. And I think that is certainly the case for me. And as a wretched junior high school student, I got involved in this campaign of this political science professor named John Tower, who was running for Johnson's Senate seat, and amazingly got elected. Now, I rang doorbells and made phone calls, very minor sorts of volunteer activity, but I feel a great link to that truly historical event. The election not only of the first Republican elected statewide in Texas to anything, but the first Republican U.S. Senator from the South since Reconstruction. Today, of course, there is a total Republican representation from the South in the U.S. Senate, I think with one exception in Florida. In any event, I appreciated that early contact that led to being invited to come here today. Well, Bob mentioned the H word, Harvard, where I happen to have fallen into an academic slough at an early part of my life. But there at the time was a great political scientist named James Q. Wilson. And among many wonderful aphorisms that Professor Wilson said about American government was this. He said that there's a major difference between the way the United States develops its leadership elite versus the more traditional countries of Western Europe and Japan, where they have a very established civil service. To get into that civil service, you have to go to a very fine university. You have to take a very competitive exam. You have to pass the exam. But once you've done that, you enter into the civil service and rise in rank to very high levels, much higher than we have the civil service in the United States. and can therefore have an ongoing impact upon the government of those nations. He said in the United States, if you back the winning presidential candidate, you are presumed to have passed the test. And that is the case for so many of us who have received political appointments. I am not going to talk exclusively about the appointment process, which is very tempting, however. If Clay Johnson were here, he might echo what I've always thought about that experience, and that is anybody who has dealt in political appointments in the White House never wants to do it again, but can never stop talking about it because it is so absorbing, so fascinating, so frustrating, so angering, so filled with anecdotes that, well, that's a separate seminar all by itself. But I do want to take certain lessons from that experience and my own personal experience, and that's why I've given the kind of whimsical title to today's lunch of A Memo to Aspiring Washington Whizzes. So let us imagine that you, and I'm speaking to a group of people of various ages here, but I'm speaking to everybody, but those younger people here who might imagine that one day they would like to serve in our national government in Washington, a very, very admirable, desirable, commendable goal, which of course I share, having had that great opportunity. So let us imagine it is a year from now, and you did back the winning presidential candidate. You passed the test, and now you want to be part of the new administration. Well, it is that special time called the transition between one administration to the other, always filled with passionate striving for position, influence with the new administration, with stories wildly leaked to newspaper about who's up and who's down, who's going to be in and who's out. This is not new. In fact, Henry Adams, who was a grumpy man who lived across Lafayette Park from the White House in the 19th century, wrote a wonderful book that still has relevance called Democracy. It was a novel published in 1880. And in that novel, he says this about the month before the inauguration of a new president. He said, "This is the moment when the two whited sepulchres," and he meant the Capitol and the White House, "when the two whited sepulchres at either end of the avenue reek with the thick atmosphere of bargain and sale. The old is going, the new is coming. Wealth, office, and power are at auction. Who bids highest? Who hates with the most venom? Who intrigues with the most skill? Who has done the dirtiest, the meanest, and the most political work? He shall have his reward." So it's not that bad, but there are elements that have carried over. So I would like to give advice to anyone here who has a hankering to have a position in either the White House or in one of the departments or agencies. The first bit of advice is, do not wait for the phone to ring. Now, there is a notion, a very fond notion, that you are so capable and so desirable that the president-elect himself or some other magnate is going to call you and ask you to come serve your country in the new administration. Well, that may happen. It may happen with cabinet secretaries, not all of them. But it doesn't happen for the humbler likes of myself, who 35 years ago was truly waiting for the phone to ring. And I realized that it wasn't going to ring, that I was thinking 100% of the time about going to Washington, and the people up in who had been elected were thinking about me about 0% of the time. So it was necessary to take direct action. You cannot assume anything. And in fact, one of those lessons of the presidential personnel experience is sometimes the obvious is not obvious. That people who you would think would be naturals are naturals and are desirable in an administration, but because it is such a crazy time of so much pressure and so much talk and so many meetings, that the obvious is often forgotten. And it does take somebody, such as the job applicant himself or herself, to get involved in and basically say, what about me? Or don't forget me. And that's why I think that you cannot wait for the phone to ring. So what's needed in that kind of circumstance is an advocate, somebody who is going to make it his or her business to push you And that ideally would be someone like a president or a vice president, but very capably enough, it can be a chief of staff or a cabinet officer or a sub-cabinet official, someone of that ilk. And that's what's needed to make you someone whose name is on the mind, or at least a piece of paper, in front of decision makers. I think it's also very valuable, if you hope to go to Washington in one of those positions, to have a plan B and sometimes a plan C. That is, if plan A is that the person you work for in the campaign, who's now the deputy White House chief of staff or some other position, if that is your main avenue, your advocate, that's terrific. But once again, the obvious may not be obvious. So it may be necessary to have some other pathways to another plan, B or C, to put into action to make sure that it comes out the way you want it. You know, being from the home state of a new president is often talked about and sometimes joked about as the way to get into a new administration. And that's largely true. But it does work both ways. I know that in the George W. Bush administration, there was the usual allegation that there were too many people from his state. Now, scratch out the name George W. Bush and write in Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, or for that matter, Grover Cleveland, and you will find people who accuse that president of having too many people from his home state. So when that happens, White Houses will do one of two things. They could just ignore all of this and name the folks from back home, or it can scuttle the other way and try to name more people from other states in order to deprive the critics of that particular line of attack. This worked out in the case of a good friend of mine who was appointed to one of the advisory boards in Washington. She's from Texas, living in Washington, but she got a call from Clay Johnson, who said, you know, when you fill out your paperwork that says where you're from, would you please say Washington and not Texas, because we have too many Texans in this administration. So she did that, and so she was of Washington, D.C. when her name went forward. The irony of that situation is that people who are living in Washington, D.C. always comprise the bulk of every new administration. Doesn't matter if it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. People who are living in Washington and its suburbs have the leading edge when it comes to going into both appointed positions of the sort that requires Senate confirmation and the kind of staff positions that, for example, a White House chooses. This is because these are people who almost by definition are part of the process. They know the policies. They know the political actors. They have the connections. They've probably been involved in fundraising for the winning presidential candidate. And more critically than anything else, I believe, they're already there physically. They don't have to worry about moving. They don't have to find a new dentist. They don't have to figure out a school for the kid. They don't have to find a job for the spouse. And in so many words, changing jobs for them is a simple matter of flicking out the light in their old office on a Friday evening and flicking on the light in their new office on Monday morning. Just a different commute, perhaps, to get from their former law firm or lobby firm or trade association to their government position. This is, as I say, been the case for many years. I predict it is going to be the case forever because, if nothing else, of the economics that I described. The cost of buying a house anywhere close to the District of Columbia is so high that it is a discouragement, I think, for all but the newest, rawest, youngest people who will rent apartments and not necessarily have to move their entire family to Washington. This is sad because we do hope that our national government reflects the breadth and depth of America. But already and increasingly, we are going to be like Britain, France, Japan, where the metropolis, the metropole, the capital city, is where the leadership elite not only resides, but is found. So let us suppose now it is inauguration time and you have successfully snared a job with the new administration. So the morning after the inaugural balls, you show up for work, maybe a little groggy, but still very excited. At which point, once in this office, be it in the White House or in one of the cabinet departments, you'll discover that very little things matter a lot in the world of Washington. Number one is, where is your office? The old saying is, where you sit is where you stand. And that's very true. And there are all sorts of ways that your office location is calibrated in Washington depending upon where you happen to work. In the Pentagon, enormous building, there are, of course, 5 sides, but there are, more importantly, 5 rings in the Pentagon. The outside ring, the E ring, is considered the most desirable because it actually has windows that look out upon the Earth, as opposed to windows that look out upon other windows inside the Pentagon. And therefore, to be in the E ring is the most important thing for a Pentagon appointee. But of the 5 sides of the Pentagon, there are only 2 that have real luster and prestige. There's the mall entrance side and the river entrance side. Well, you can do the arithmetic and figure out that there's not any way you can keep on stuffing people into just 2 sides of even a big building like the Pentagon. So they have to leach away into other rings or other sides of the building, and that will be an indication of their status. If where they have their office is in the prime places, they're high status. And it's not enough, incidentally, just to be on the E-ring. You have to have an even-numbered office in the E-ring because they're the ones that have the windows to the outside world. Somebody looking at the business card, noticing that somebody's on the E-ring but an odd-numbered office, indicates that they are lower status than before. That's the Pentagon. In the White House, it's the question of whether you're in the West Wing. The West Wing being the extension of the historic White House that we all think about, which is definitely the power center. That's where the president, the vice president, the chief of staff, the national security advisor, all those people you read about in the history books and see on the evening news have their offices. And the most important White House staff members have their offices in the West Wing. The rest of the White House staff is next door in the magnificent old executive office building, which was originally built to house the state, war, and navy buildings in the 19th century. A magnificent place with marble fireplaces and high ceilings and very spacious offices, much bigger than anything in the West Wing. But Washingtonians know that if you're in the executive office building and not in the West Wing, then you can't possibly be that important. So those things matter. Parking is very important as well. Whether you have it is a sign of status, and where you have it is another sign of status. How far you are from the entrance in the parking lot will determine whether you are down the totem pole from those who are on top. Now, other people, lesser beings, have to commute by the metro or take the bus or park at some remote spot and hike in. Nevertheless, there are these gradations made of parking in those circumstances. Another has to do with whether you have privileges at the dining facility, by which I mean the White House mess, or the secretary's mess in the departments and agencies. Mess being a military word, which is basically a club. It's a limited membership. People are billed at the end of the month for the amount of food that they have. But what we're talking about is the executive dining room. Whether you can take your guests to the executive dining room is definitely a mark of status. Another thing is to where is your seat on the airplane, or whether you're even on the airplane at all, if the potentate, the secretary, or the president travels. And sometimes it even matters what is the color of your security badge, because different colors indicate different kinds of access. In the White House, if you have a blue badge, that means you can go anywhere, West Wing, or the Executive Office Building. If you have a red badge, that means you can't go to the West Wing. You have to have somebody clear you in and escort you. So it is definitely déclassé to have a red badge versus a blue badge. So all these things are trivial, to say the least, but they matter in Washington. It's just the reality. You're no longer in Kansas, you are in Oz when it comes to the world of Washington. I think it's important for newcomers, political appointees, to establish a very wide circle of friends. And if not real friends, then at least contacts, acquaintances, people who are your colleagues in the administration, to have a very wide circle in a large number of departments. This is important in order to do your job, because you never know when, if you're at the Commerce Department and you have a friend at the Treasury Department, that it shorts the circuit of the journey of getting something done, to have a friend in contact you can call up at that department instead of going through channels in the traditional bureaucratic way. It also helps you keep current on news and what's happening inside the administration, and it helps you learn the gossip when that becomes important. And even more critically, it helps you learn when there are job openings that you will hear through your friends in the network much sooner than you will any other way. In fact, if you read about a resignation in the Washington Post, it may already be too late to try to line up that job because somebody else may have gotten there first. So while it's important to have real functional friends in the administration, it's also important to beware of people on the outside of the administration who will want to make you their new best friend. And I'm talking about lobbyists and reporters and associated hangers-on who will always want to curry favor with people who are on the inside and drop you just as quickly when you are no longer on the inside and the administration changes. The best technique or the best guide to figuring out who these people are is just to ask yourself a simple question, and that is, if the other candidate had won the presidential election and somebody else were sitting in this office, in this chair, would these people be making the same play for their friendship as they are for mine? Well, to ask the question is to answer it with the kind of people we're talking about. The answer is yes, and if so, they're the ones to be avoided. I think it's valuable in life, but especially in bureaucracy, to be nice to everybody. And I mean, in particular, be nice to the people who have functional jobs who are lower visibility. And I mean, like the guards and the secretaries and the mail messengers who go around from office to office delivering envelopes, and the telephone operators. I can't tell you how valuable it is to be considered a good person by these people, because they know how things really work. They talk among themselves. They put out the word as to who is good and not so good in the new team. And they, of course, can be very, very helpful from time to time. When I proposed to my wife, who was also a White House staffer at the time, I went in to announce this to the chief of staff, who was Governor John Sununu at the time. And I said to Governor Sununu, I just want you to know that I'm now engaged and about to announce my engagement. And he said, to whom? And his deputy, a fellow named Ed Rogers, who today is a power lobbyist in Washington, said, wait a minute. And he picked up the telephone. It was the White House line. The White House operator came on the line and he said, who is Chase Untermeyer marrying? And the White House operator said, why, Diana Kendrick, of course. Thank you. They knew this. Now, as for the more senior career people, what we can call bureaucrats, career civil servants, members of the senior executive corps, etc., this is a very special challenge, but not an impossible one. And in fact, this is so much a subject of importance of how political appointees deal with career people, both civilian, military, foreign service, and others, that it could be the subject of a seminar or even a course here at the Tower Center. But you're going to get about 60 seconds on the subject from me. But I cannot emphasize this enough. And I can't tell you how valuable it was for me on the eve of my going to Washington with then Vice President George Bush, that I read a book called Government of Strangers, written in 1977 by a man named Hugh Hecklow, a political scientist who did a study of political appointees in Washington bureaus. And I got some of the nuggets from that book that I want to share with you. One thing that Hecklow said is, political executives do not need to trust everybody in the bureaucracy, but they need to trust someone. And equally important, they themselves need to be trusted to some degree. Very valuable for those of us, particularly on the Republican side of the House, who either listened to or gave speeches at many a Rotary Club before the election talking about federal bureaucrats who it always seemed to me had conflicting traits. Federal bureaucrats were denounced as lazy and shiftless, while at the same time they were working overtime and relentlessly to pursue a separate agenda from the president. Well, whatever it was, we didn't like them. And that was the predisposition for many people, myself included, who arrived in Washington at the start of the Reagan administration. Well, I'm glad I had read my Hecklo and realized that I needed to have some people in the bureaucracy I could work with, and discovered that you can indeed work with people in a large organization. After all, people are people. They aren't always conspiring and malign and of evil intent. They may have indeed the same shared objectives as the president. They may have read the newspaper after the election and realized that there was a change in government and that they needed to change their policies and attitudes. So very important to find those allies and work with them. Another thing Hecklo said was, political executives can usually do better by evoking cooperation rather than invoking their authority. That is, trying to win people's cooperation and make them part of the team rather than to tell them, you will do this because I'm your boss. At that point, you've lost. I think Colin Powell once said that he never ever said, soldier, that's an order, because he knew if he ever had to say that, he had lost the issue altogether. And finally, Hecklo said, the U.S. executive branch is a place for violinists, not kazoo players. And I've been thinking about that as we have a candidate for president, I won't mention his name, but he comes from New York, who is not a kazoo player, he is a tuba player, and but we still need violinists. Another wonderful nugget about dealing with the bureaucracy was said by Chester Bowles. Chester Bowles was a Democratic politician from Connecticut. He had various positions in the in the Roosevelt Truman administration, and he came back in the Kennedy administration. He was quoted as saying, getting the bureaucracy to accept new ideas is like carrying a double mattress up a very narrow and winding stairway. It is a terrible job, and you exhaust yourself when you try it. But once you get the mattress up, it is awfully hard for anyone else to get it down. Another bit of bureaucratic wisdom. I think another thing that's often overlooked amongst political appointees in Washington is the value of longevity. After all, in dealing with bureaucracy, what is their great advantage is the fact that they've been there before you got there, and they're going to be there after you've gotten there. Well, if you, the political appointee, manage to hang on for more than the usual 2 to 4 years of service, you might actually have a chance to outlast them. This is particularly true in the military departments because officers do change, and they depend upon the filing cabinets rather than their own memories and private goals in order to carry on a old policy. So the political appointee who hangs on longer is able to effect many a change that otherwise wouldn't happen. And longevity also has its rewards in the sense that at the end of every administration, junior people are more likely to be picked up for promotion to senior positions that fall open in the last 1 or 2 years of administration. Nobody is going to move from Cleveland to Washington to take a job that's only going to last a year. So they will go to the deputy assistant and ask them if they would take the presidential appointment. They will, and that means they get a little boost in the next administration when they have the higher position on their resume. And if they hang on in Washington and join a lobby firm or whatnot, that also serves them as a credit. So, some concluding general advice to people who would love to take that trail and go to Washington, and that is to go there for the right reason. And the right reason or reasons is to help your president fulfill the mandate of the American people, to participate in history while it's being made, and above all, to learn. I don't think there's a wrong reason, but there is a not so right reason, and that is to make yourself a celebrity of the sort that will want to be on television or go on the lecture circuit or otherwise be a high dollar earner after government service, and closely allied with that particular wrongful direction, in my view, is to gratify those people outside the world of the White House and the departments who you might want to ask for a job one of these days in the lobby, in a trade association, in the press, wherever it may be. I consider this to be a form of self-corruption when the official begins to take certain courses of action with the hope of future employment. And I'm sorry to say that we live in an age where that metropole I referred to, Washington, does tend to retain people who have served in administrations because it does have very well paid and sometimes prestigious jobs waiting for them if they have made the right connections and gratified enough people along the way. I will say less with a sense of nobility than maybe a confession that I didn't do Washington the right way, that when I left government, nobody did offer me one of those jobs. So I had to go back to Houston, and I actually think that's something that few political appointees ever do that they should do, which is to go home rather than stay on in Washington. Home, after all, is not only more real than Washington, it's often the place where you can once again reconnect with the reality of the nation that is not always reflected in our nation's capital, and to gain restoration and maybe a little bit more emphasis to return to Washington in some later year. So, final bit of advice is for any appointee is not just to be a hanger-on, to know when it is your time to leave as just to quit and to go back home or otherwise do something different. So, following my own good advice here, I am now going to quit. And I thank you very much for your kind attention this afternoon. Is there time for questions?
Yeah, we have time for questions.
All right, very good. I do not want to orate too long here, but
Let me start out with a question.
Yes.
Some of the governments around the world insist that the U.S. ambassador be a political appointee. I was one, you were one. But there have not been very many political appointees to Qatar. I just wonder if you could explain that and where that comes from and ended up.
Yes. In amongst all ambassadorships in the United States government, it doesn't matter which administration, roughly 2/3 are held by career Foreign Service officers, people who take the exam and enter the ranks and rise in those ranks, and through a kind of politics of their own, that is the internal politics of the State Department, they are singled out for recommendation to the White House as appointments. And they tend to go to the less glamorous, still highly interesting and important parts of the world. Meanwhile, the other 1/3 are the so-called non-career or political appointees, and they are the kind of people of legend. Ambassador Jordan and I may be slight exceptions to this, but the legendary political appointees are those who were big money givers and fundraisers for the winning president. Maybe they have other connections into the president. They may be a college roommate. They may be an old friend. They may be somebody who is a defeated senator or a former university president. All of this is within the gift and decision of the president. But presidents, as a rule, will take the advice of the Secretary of State when it comes to the kind of routine post that a ambassador will fill. The exceptions are very few, but Ambassador Jordan is an excellent example because Saudi Arabia, and I think Morocco only, other nation in the Arab world that I can think of, are savvy enough to know that a political appointee is much more likely to have these connections and contacts back to the president and other members of the administration than is a Foreign Service officer. Some people may also say, somewhat cynically, that the political appointee is also not likely to speak Arabic, and as a result will be able to sit there in benign ignorance at the time when conversations are going on. There was a very celebrated predecessor of Ambassador Jordan's named Hume Horan, who was the most gifted Arabic speaker ever in the history of the United States, maybe in the entire Arabic-speaking world. But he spoke Arabic so well that I think he embarrassed the Saudis that they didn't speak the language as well as he did. And of course, he could also understand what they were saying, and he lasted a very short period of time. He was declared persona non grata over a matter, but I really think it had to do with the fact that he was too good at the native language. The wisdom that the Saudis and the Moroccans recognize is that people who come out of the political world have connections that can be very, very valuable. And in my case, I was made a non-career appointee in a country, Qatar, that traditionally did not have political appointees. Only one of my dozen or 15 predecessors had been non-career, and he was a professor of Middle Eastern Studies at California University, named during the Reagan administration. So that was unusual, but it is the exception that proves the rule.
Chase.
Sir.
Having spent a fair chunk of your adult life in D.C. and also in Houston, we always hear about how in D.C. it's cutthroat, it's dog eat dog, it's a totally different ambiance, relationships are different, people are less trustworthy, shorter attention spans. Give us your perspective as somebody who's actually lived in the two places. Did you find that to be true, or is that exaggerated, or what's your perspective on
Well, there is truth in every exaggeration, so I cannot deny that there are elements of exactly what you had to say. The famous line attributed to Harry Truman is, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog, and then don't really trust your dog all that much either. That was Untermeyer, not Truman, that part. But I think you find that Washington, D.C., or for that matter, Moscow or London or Canberra, for all I know, are the same. They are aggregations of people, and while there are certain pressures and loyalties and jealousies and other human emotions that come to play in a capital city, probably any capital city in history, the opposite is also true. You will find friendship, you will find love, you will find sympathy, all kinds of other human emotions if you are open to them. And that's why I felt that it was a mistake for many people to come to Washington with these preconceived notions, like what civil servants are like, that close their mind to the possibility of friendships and cooperative working relationships. So it doesn't have to be that way, but and while it does sound like a typical political joke to talk about Washington as this very special place that is undesirable and repugnant, there is something to be said for stepping away from it. That's why I do believe it's valuable, even for somebody who later comes back to Washington in another capacity, to have gone into a different atmosphere where things are in greater perspective. And the way I like to think of it in comparing Washington to Texas is that Texans, for the most part, think about the present and the future, whereas Washingtonians think about the present and the past. And you're never, ever quite free of your past. Lázaro Cárdenas, who was president of Mexico in the 1930s, said that in politics, no one is ever fully alive or fully dead. And that is definitely an attitude that you find in places like Washington that happily is different where we are.
So Washington is full of zombies?
He didn't quite say that. Yes, sir.
Do you think that we'll ever see term limits for members of Congress? And if so, what effect would that have?
No. I mean, there's no incentive for members of Congress to limit themselves. And in fact, the term limiting that was done in America largely
25 years ago was done at the state and local level where there's initiative and referendum, where it could arise from the folks as opposed to from the top down as constitutional amendments typically are. But also from a very practical point of view, less a matter of personal ambition and desire to hang on, as the fact that there is what is to be gained if you are a senator or a representative from a state like Wyoming or Vermont or Idaho. The population, being what it is, will always be small, and anything that shifts away from the authority and the extra clout that comes from being senior, from having longevity, is why Congress has acted the way it has and given leadership roles to people from small states. If there were term limits and people were thrown out after fairly short periods of time, or even semi-reasonable lengths of time, pretty much everybody would be treated the same, and they would not get the benefits for their home states as they can now. This is another reason, a parallel question about the Electoral College. It's not in the interest of small states, regardless if they're blue or red, for the Electoral College to go away, because if the Electoral College did go away and we elected presidents entirely by popular vote, then campaigners would only go to the coastal areas and totally ignore the breadth of the country. So our system, like it or not, does allow a degree of equality that wouldn't be found otherwise. Yes, please.
Firstly, thank you, sir, for taking the time to come and speak. I would like to ask, how did your military service translate to your public service in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, I found it very valuable, especially when I was an appointee at the Navy Department. I wanted to be an appointee at the Navy Department because I had served an active duty during the Vietnam War sometime before. I was only in active duty for 2 years. I did not plan to be a career officer. I took advantage, in fact, of an opportunity to have a year chopped off of my service because I thought, not out of cynicism, but just the facts of politics, that I could probably get to a higher rank through politics than I would by staying in uniform and rising in ranks. This does not speak against those people who loyally do remain in uniform and rise in rank, such that when I became an Assistant Secretary of the Navy and I had the equivalent rank of a 4-star admiral or general, I never thought of myself as a real 4-star in the way that they had their rank, because they had really earned it. Now, my rank was important because it denoted that I was a presidential appointee, that I had those authorities and that expectation to do what I was appointed to do by the president. And the rank enabled me to work with those people at a certain level and to fit in at levels that they understood because of the importance of rank in such an organization. I think it was also very valuable in that I was aide to an admiral. I was a very junior officer, an O2, lieutenant junior grade, and I was aide to an admiral in the Philippines. During the Vietnam War, there were all kinds of senior military and civilians who came into our territory. The admiral for whom I worked was the senior U.S. military officer in the Philippines. He related directly to the Philippine government and to the U.S. ambassador. And for me, as the aide, the fellow who was to take his hat and the briefcase and to get the car and do all sorts of aidely type of things, I nevertheless had a chance to be in an atmosphere that later was very directly helpful when I was an ambassador or working in the White House myself. That is, I actually had that benefit. And I think that is, I was a terrible aide, but I'm grateful to the memory of the admiral now departed for whom I worked that he gave me that chance, because it meant discomfort and maybe some disagreement or disagreeableness on his part when I messed up. But he was giving me a chance to learn, and that's what we can all hope to do for the people we work with. Yes, sir.
Could I just follow up on Diana's question? You've seen civil-military relations from both sides, as an officer, as a high-ranking civilian as well. I'm just curious if you had some big-picture thoughts on when civil-military relations work best. When do we get the most out of that relationship in terms of making good decisions, and when does it break down?
It works best when the civilian officials, whatever their title and rank and service, work with their military counterparts and, truth to be said, the senior civil service as well, in a sense of collegiality, of common cause, of recognizing that they are together in something bigger than themselves. It is so easy in human life, particularly in a world like Washington or maybe Hollywood and Wall Street for that matter, where rivalries and expectations and ambitions get in the way of the common purpose. So when civil-military relations work well, it's because people are thinking of the defense of the country, or maybe more parochially, but still larger than themselves, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, whatever it may be. And that, I believe, is what helps makes things happen. This is true in other walks as well. I consider that the reason the Texas Legislature as a legislative body works much better than the Congress of the United States is that here we have something called Texas that pretty much everybody thinks is worth trying to do right by and to serve and to remember at times when other distractions come into play. So I believe the same is true in national government at other levels. If you always keep your mind on the larger goal of why you're there and what you aim to accomplish, that helps make things work. And then personal respect that comes from knowing people on a more than just formal basis definitely helps. The fact that I had been a junior naval officer did help me with senior naval officers when I was an Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, I don't think they were just humoring me, but the fact that I had been to sea, even in a very humble capacity, meant that I had something in my background that was common with theirs. And I accepted it as such, and I think if there were people who were just trying to flatter me or make me feel that I was one of the men in blue in a way I never was, then I took action appropriately. But I do believe that that commonality did help. And that's what's missing, unfortunately, in the world of Washington is some kind of commonality that causes people to work together, be it in Congress or be it in the bureaucracy or probably outside as well. Well, I don't want to keep people trapped here. Leader?
Many thanks, Ambassador.
Thank you
This
so
was really
much.
delightful.